"Take my coat," the cowboy said, and Grace Anderson looked at him like he'd lost his mind. She was frozen to the bone, 2,000 miles from everything she'd ever known, standing in a Montana blizzard, about to marry a complete stranger. And this man, this broad-shouldered marshal, with snow on his hat and cold dark eyes, was already taking off his coat and putting it around her shoulders before she could refuse. "I don't need your coat," she said. "I know," Owen said. "I'm giving it anyway." And that was the moment Grace understood this man was going to be the most dangerous thing she'd ever survived. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and follow Grace's journey all the way to the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Grace had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the train. She had practiced what she would say, how she would hold herself, the exact tone of voice that would communicate that she was capable, steady, and not at all the desperate woman the advertisement had made her sound like. Educated Boston woman. 28, seeks honest arrangement in the Western Territories. Willing to work, willing to learn, will not be a burden. She had not rehearsed what to do when her legs gave out on the stagecoach step. One second she was reaching for the iron rail, and the next the ground came up fast, and her knees hit the frozen earth, and her traveling bag burst open, and 3 years of her life scattered across the mud. A hairbrush. 2 letters from her dead mother. A small book of poetry she'd carried since she was 14, and 1 very undignified bottle of headache powder that rolled under the wheel and disappeared. She heard boots. Fast. Then 2 hands caught her under the arms before she fully hit the ground, and she was upright again before she'd even finished the thought of falling. "Easy," the man said. "I've got you." She pulled herself free immediately. Old habit. "I'm fine," she said, which was the most spectacular lie she had told in recent memory. "You've been on a stagecoach for 3 days through mountain weather," he said. "You don't have to be fine." She looked at him, then really looked. Owen Ellis was not what the letter had prepared her for either. The agency's description had read, "Widower 34 town marshal owns property. Stable income, seeks companion for permanent arrangement." That description had conjured someone weathered and grim, all practicality, and no warmth, the kind of man who would view a mail-order wife the way he might view a new plow, useful, necessary, no sentiment involved. Owen Ellis had kind eyes. That was the first thing she noticed, and it unsettled her completely, because kind eyes on a stranger were somehow harder to trust than cold ones. "Marshal Ellis," she said. "Owen," he said. "You can call me Owen." "We're not married yet." "No," he said. "We're not." And something in the way he said it, no impatience, no complaint, just a plain acknowledgement of fact, made her feel oddly off balance in a way the cold hadn't. He picked up her scattered things. Every single one. He handed them back without comment, without the slight pause at the headache powder that she had expected from a man who might take that as evidence of weakness. He simply picked it up and handed it to her the way you'd hand someone their dignity back. She didn't say thank you. She was still too busy being suspicious. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Adeline Pruitt, who appeared to be approximately 70 years old, built like a fence post, and utterly incapable of lowering her voice. "She's smaller than I thought," Mrs. Pruitt said to Owen, as though Grace were not standing 3 feet away. "I'm standing right here," Grace said. "I can see that, honey. I'm not blind." Mrs. Pruitt looked her up and down with the frank appraisal of a woman who had seen everything twice and formed opinions about all of it. "Boston," they said. "You look like Boston. That's not an insult. I was in Boston once. Too many buildings, not enough sky. Come inside before you lose an ear to frostbite." Owen reached for Grace's bag. She held onto it. "I can carry my own bag," she said. He let go without argument. That happened so fast, the not arguing, that it took Grace a full 3 seconds to realize she was still braced for a fight that wasn't coming. Inside the boarding house was warm and loud, with the smell of wood smoke and something cooking that made Grace's stomach remind her loudly that she had eaten almost nothing since Billings. "Sit," Mrs. Pruitt said, pointing at a chair near the fire. "I'll bring food." Oh, and you sit too. Stop standing there looking responsible. It makes people nervous. I make people nervous, Owen said. You make her nervous, Mrs. Pruitt said, gesturing at Grace without looking at her. She's been holding that bag like she expects someone to take it since she walked in. Grace set the bag down deliberately. I'm not nervous. Mrs. Pruitt set a bowl of something hot in front of her and gave her the look of a woman who had raised 4 sons and was not remotely fooled. Of course not, honey. Grace ate. She was so hungry that the first spoonful made her eyes sting, and she had to work very hard at eating slowly and looking like a person who was not on the edge of tears over a bowl of beef stew. Owen didn't watch her eat. He talked to Mrs. Pruitt about town business, something about the livery, something about a dispute between 2 ranchers over fence lines, and he kept his eyes on that conversation with such determined courtesy that Grace slowly understood he was giving her privacy. In a room with 3 people in it, he was somehow making space for her to fall apart, quietly, recover quietly, and collect herself without an audience. She wasn't used to that. She wasn't sure she trusted it. Nay. After supper, Owen sat across from her in the small front room, and they had the conversation that had been waiting since the stagecoach step. I want to be honest with you, he said, which was either the most reassuring thing a man could say or the most alarming, depending on what followed it. Go ahead, Grace said. The agency told me things about you. I don't know how much of it's accurate, and I don't much care. I'd rather learn who you are from you directly than from a form letter. Grace studied him. That's a careful way of saying the agency probably made me sound better than I am. The corner of his mouth moved. They made both of us sound better than we probably are. What did they say about you? Stable, reliable, good prospect. He paused. What they didn't say is that I've been alone for 4 years and I've gotten strange about it. I keep the house too quiet. I forget to eat until it's dark. I work too many hours because that's easier than being in a house that doesn't have anyone in it. He looked at her steadily. I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you know what you're actually walking into. Grace was quiet for a moment. My father's business failed 2 years ago, she said finally. He lost the house. He lost everything. I'd been teaching at a girls' school, and they closed the term and didn't reopen. By last winter, I was borrowing against borrowed money and the kindness of people who were running out of patience for it. She paused. So the agency made me sound like a woman of independent spirit seeking adventure in the West. What I actually am is a woman who ran out of options. She said it flatly, no apology in it. Owen nodded slowly. That's honest. I thought you wanted honest. I do. He leaned forward slightly. Does that mean you're only here because you had nowhere else to go? Grace held his gaze. It means I'm here. What I make of being here that depends on more than I can tell you tonight. A silence settled between them. Not a bad silence. The kind that comes after 2 people have told each other something true and are both deciding what to do with it. The preacher can marry us Friday, Owen said, if that's still what you want. It's what we agreed to, Grace said. That's not the same as what you want. She looked at him for a long moment. Ask me again on Friday morning. She didn't sleep well. The room Mrs. Pruitt had given her was warm and quiet. The bed was the softest surface she'd been horizontal on since she left Boston, and she lay in it completely rigid and stared at the ceiling and thought about what she'd done. 2,000 miles. She had traveled 2,000 miles to a town called Hecla, Montana, which she'd had to look up on a map to confirm it was real, to marry a man she had exchanged exactly 6 letters with. The letters had been decent, careful. He wrote like a man who chose his words slowly and meant what he said. He had not promised her love. He had promised her a home fair treatment and the freedom to leave if it didn't suit either of them after a reasonable period. That last part had done it. The freedom to leave. Every other advertisement she'd answered had implied some variation of, "You will be grateful for what you receive." Owen Ellis had written, "I won't hold you to something that doesn't work. That wouldn't be fair to either of us." A man who thought about fairness. She'd thought that meant she understood him. Now she had seen those eyes and heard him say, "I've gotten strange about it," with such plain, undefended honesty, and she realized she had not understood anything at all. She sat up in the dark. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. She thought about her mother, who had married for love and spent 30 years in a beautiful city apartment with a man who loved her deeply and died young. She thought about her aunt, who had married for security and spent 30 years in a comfortable house, resenting every inch of it. She didn't know which kind of life she was choosing. She wasn't sure she was choosing at all, so much as falling forward into the only open door. But then she thought about Owen picking up her scattered things. Every single one, without comment. She lay back down. She didn't sleep, but she stopped fighting the dark. In the morning, the storm was worse. Mrs. Pruitt delivered this information with the cheerfulness of a woman who had survived 30 Montana winters and viewed weather as a personal adversary she had already beaten so many times it had become routine. "Storm sitting right over us. Could be 2 days, could be 4. Nobody's going anywhere." "The wedding?" Grace started. "Preacher says when the storm breaks," Mrs. Pruitt said. "He's not riding out in this for anything short of an actual act of God, and he's the one who gets to decide what counts." Owen arrived at the boarding house mid-morning, stepping through the door in a coat that was white with snow, shaking the ice off his hat, with the casual efficiency of a man performing a motion he'd repeated 10,000 times. He looked across the room at Grace and said, "Good morning." Like it was a simple thing, like she was a person he'd known long enough that the greeting required no ceremony. "You walked here in this," she said. "It's only 3 blocks." 3 blocks of Montana winter, he said. "I know. I grew up here." He hung his coat. He sat down. He accepted the coffee Mrs. Pruitt pressed on him with a quiet thanks. Then he looked at Grace again. "How did you sleep?" "Fine," she said, which was becoming her standard lie. "Mrs. Pruitt's guest rooms are hard to sleep in the first night," he said, not unkindly. "Something about the quiet. Town sounds different than the city." "It's not that." "What is it then?" She had not expected him to press. She looked at him. "I'm still deciding," she said. "About all of it. I'm allowed to still be deciding." "Yes," Owen said. "You are." And again that thing he did, that complete absence of pushing, of demanding, of making her feel like she owed him certainty she didn't have. He simply received what she said and settled back into his chair. "Then let's not talk about the wedding. What would you like to know about Hecla?" She blinked. "What?" "You're going to live here," he said. "Storm or no storm, wedding or no wedding, you're here now. You might as well know what kind of place you're in." Something in her chest loosened slightly. "All right," she said. "Tell me about it." So he did. He told her about the town like a man who had watched it grow from nothing, about the miners who had come first, and the merchants who had followed, about the one-room school that had burned and been rebuilt twice, about the saloon that had burned once and been rebuilt immediately, because everyone agreed that was more urgent. He told her about the families who had stayed through the bad winters and the ones who hadn't, about the young doctor who had arrived the previous spring from Philadelphia and was still faintly bewildered by everything about the Chinese cook at the hotel, who made the best pie in 3 counties and refused to share the recipe with anyone. He didn't tell it like a promotional pamphlet. He told it like someone who had grievances with the place and loved it anyway. Grace found herself listening without watching the door. That was the first time since the stagecoach that she forgot to be afraid. It was in the early afternoon that Mrs. Pruitt produced a deck of cards and announced that they were playing poker, and when Grace said she didn't know how both Owen and Mrs. Pruitt looked at her with the exact same expression of polite disbelief. "You went to school in Boston," Mrs. Pruitt said. "A girls' school. And none of those girls played cards." "Not that kind." Mrs. Pruitt shook her head slowly, as if cataloging a significant gap in Grace's education. "Owen," she said, "teach her." Owen looked at Grace. "Do you want to learn right now? Storm's going to last 2 more days at least. There's not much else." Grace looked at the cards. She thought about the women at the school in Boston. The careful women, the contained women, the women who held their hands in their laps and spoke when spoken to and slowly disappeared. She thought about how far she was from all of that. "Yes," she said. "Deal." He moved his chair closer to hers so she could see his hands as he explained, and she was struck by how entirely unself-conscious it was, the physical closeness of it, the arm that came near her shoulder to point at a card without touching her, the low, patient voice explaining the hierarchy of hands, with the same seriousness he'd probably use to explain the hierarchy of anything. He smelled like wood smoke and cold air. She noticed that. She didn't want to notice it, but she did. They played 3 rounds. Grace lost all 3 once badly and twice with enough near success that she could tell she was actually learning. Mrs. Pruitt played with silent ruthlessness and won everything which she clearly considered her absolute right. "You bluffed too early," Owen told Grace after the 3rd round. "I don't know how to bluff." "Everybody knows how to bluff," he said. "You've been doing it since you stepped off the stagecoach." She went very still. He met her eyes, and there was nothing unkind in his, just the plain direct gaze of a man who saw things and said them and had apparently decided she could handle both. "I'm not bluffing," she said. "You told me you slept fine." A beat. "That's not bluffing. That's just privacy." "Fair enough," he said, and dealt the next hand. But something had shifted. Fractionally. The way ice shifts at the very beginning of a thaw, not breaking, not giving way, just moving. A small acknowledgement that the surface was not quite as solid as it appeared. Grace picked up her cards. She was holding 3 queens, and she didn't let her face change at all. Owen noticed. She could tell from the slight adjustment of his expression, not surprise exactly, but something like recognition. He said quietly. She kept her face completely neutral. "Maybe you know how to bluff after all," he said. That evening, as the storm hammered the walls and the fire kept the room honest, Mrs. Pruitt went to bed early with the stated intention of letting the 2 of them talk like proper strangers, trying to become something else. And Owen and Grace sat in the front room in the particular quiet of 2 people who have run out of easy conversation and haven't yet decided whether to go deeper or retreat. Owen spoke first. "My wife's name was Clara," he said. "She died of fever 4 years ago. There were no children. I want to tell you that before we go any further because it matters." Grace set her teacup down. "I know. The agency mentioned it." "The agency mentioned it as a fact," he said. "I want to tell you what it was actually like." She looked at him. He looked back, and for the first time all day, some of the steadiness in him showed its cost. The faint tension around his jaw, the slight shift in his hands on the arms of the chair. "We had 3 years," he said. "They were good years. She laughed a lot. She was bad at cooking and didn't care at all about being bad at it, which I liked because I always did the cooking, and she always made it seem like a gift instead of a necessity." He paused. "When she got sick, she made me promise not to stop living. She was very specific about it. She made me actually say the words." "Did you?" Grace asked quietly. "I said the words." He looked at her directly. "I'm not sure I've kept the promise." The fire cracked. The wind pushed at the walls. "That's why the agency," Grace said. It wasn't a question. "That's part of it," he said. "The other part is, I'm 34 years old, and I want a life that has someone in it again. And that's not something a man of my reputation in this town is supposed to admit, so I admitted it to a letter instead." Grace thought about her own letter. "Will not be a burden." As if the most important thing she could offer a stranger was the promise of her own smallness. "We're both here under somewhat false pretenses," she said. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but close. "I'd say we're both here under very honest pretenses that we were too afraid to use the right words for." The fire popped. Grace picked up her teacup again. "Owen," she said, which was the first time she'd used his first name without thinking about it, and she heard it the moment she said it, the change in it, the absence of formality. What do you actually want? Not what you said in the letter. What you actually want. He was quiet for a moment. A real quiet, not an evasive one. I want to have breakfast with someone again, he said finally. I want to hear another person's opinion about something that doesn't involve legal disputes or livestock. I want to come home and have it feel like a home instead of a building I own. He paused. And I think I want to not be afraid of caring about someone again, even though that is considerably harder than any of the rest of it. The honesty of it landed in the room like something physical. Grace held it like the three queens she hadn't shown anyone earlier, close, careful, not sure yet what to do with them. I want to be useful, she said at last. Not just tolerated. I want to build something and have it be mine. I want to earn my place here instead of occupying it on sufferance. She looked at the fire. And I think I want to trust someone again. I stopped after my father's business fell apart. There were a lot of people who were very kind to us while we were prosperous and very absent afterward. She glanced at him. You can understand why I keep checking for the exit. I can, he said. I'll keep the exit clear. She looked at him sharply. I mean it, he said, quiet and direct. If you decide this isn't what you want, I won't make it hard for you to leave. I said that in the letter, and I meant it then, and I mean it now. I won't hold you here against your preference. I'd rather you stay because you chose to than because you felt you had no other choice. The thing in Grace's chest that had been clenched since Boston, the hard, tight knot of braced for the worst that she'd been carrying across 2,000 miles, loosened one more degree. Only one. But it was real. Friday, she said. He looked at her. Ask me Friday morning, she said. If I want the wedding, ask me again then. Owen Ellis nodded slowly. Friday morning, he agreed. He banked the fire before he left. He did it the way he did everything, without ceremony, without calling attention to it, just a quiet, practical act of care for a space that still contained someone he didn't want to see cold. Grace watched him pull on his coat. Owen, she said. He paused at the door. The three queens, she said. I had them all along. He looked at her for a moment, and this time, what happened to his face was an actual smile, not large, not performed, just genuine, and a little surprised, like something that came out before he thought to hold it back. I know, he said. I was wondering when you'd play them. He went out into the storm. Grace sat alone in the warm room and pressed one hand flat against the center of her chest, and felt her own heartbeat steady, still uncertain, but present. Still there. Still hers. She had made it 2,000 miles. She had sat through the cold, and the fear and the humiliation of her scattered things on frozen ground. And she had eaten hot stew, and learned poker, and told a stranger the truth about who she actually was. And he had not flinched. Friday was 3 days away. She would decide then. But sitting in that fire-lit room, with the storm building outside, and the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of her own quiet breathing. Grace Anderson, for the first time in 2 years, did not reach for the exit. She sat still. She let the warmth in. Friday came faster than Grace expected, and slower than she could bear. The storm broke Thursday night, not gently, not with any of the gradual softening she might have hoped for. But all at once, the way bad things often ended in her experience abruptly without apology, leaving everything it had touched frozen in place. She woke Friday morning to silence so complete it felt like a held breath, and she lay still in Mrs. Pruitt's guest bed and stared at the ceiling and waited to feel something clear. She didn't. What she felt was the same thing she'd been feeling for 3 days, a tangle of fear and something else she hadn't named yet. Something that kept snagging on the memory of Owen's face when she'd told him about the three queens. That small, real, unguarded smile. She got up. She dressed carefully. She did her hair with hands that were steadier than she'd expected. Then she walked downstairs and Owen was already there. He stood when she came in. Not with ceremony, just the automatic courtesy of a man who had been raised to stand when a woman entered a room and hadn't ever thought to question it. He had his hat in his hands. He looked like a man who had also not slept particularly well, and the honesty of that, the visible evidence that this morning cost him something too, did more for Grace's composure than any amount of reassurance would have. "Friday morning," he said. "Friday morning," she said. They looked at each other across the room. "Do you want the wedding?" he asked. Straight, no preamble, the way he'd promised. Grace took one breath, let it out slow. "Yes," she said. Something moved through him, not relief exactly, more like the release of a thing he'd been holding very carefully for 3 days. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His grip on the hat loosened. "All right," he said quietly. "Then let's go get married." Mrs. Pruitt appeared from the kitchen with the expression of a woman who had been listening at the door and had absolutely no shame about it. "I'll get my coat," she said. The church was cold in the way that small frontier churches were always cold, the kind that the stove couldn't quite reach the corners of, that settled into the pews and the floorboards and waited. There were 4 people present: Grace Owen, Mrs. Pruitt, and a man named Deputy Cal Reeves, who Owen had brought as witness, and who looked approximately 22 years old, and intensely aware that he had been asked to attend something important and was not sure how to arrange his face for it. The preacher was a compact, serious man named Reverend Holt, who had conducted dozens of these arrangements turned marriages in the Montana territories, and had long since stopped reading sentiment into them that wasn't there. He read the ceremony with plain, clean efficiency, and when he reached the part that required Owen and Grace to face each other, Grace made the mistake of actually looking at Owen's eyes, and then she could not look away. He was frightened. She could see it, not the terror of a man who didn't want to be there, but the particular fear of someone who wanted something badly enough that the wanting itself had become dangerous. The same fear she'd been carrying for 3 days and trying to hide behind a straight spine and flat answers. They were both terrified. The recognition of it hit her so squarely that she almost laughed, and the almost laugh came out as something that probably looked like composure, but felt from the inside like the first honest breath she'd taken all week. "Do you Owen James Ellis?" Reverend Holt began. "I do," Owen said, which was slightly ahead of schedule, and Reverend Holt paused with the patience of a man accustomed to nervous grooms. "I hadn't finished," he said. "I know," Owen said. "I do anyway." Cal Reeves made a sound that he quickly converted into a cough. Mrs. Pruitt did not bother pretending it wasn't delightful. Grace looked at Owen and said her own vows when they came clearly without faltering, and when Reverend Holt pronounced them married, and Owen took her hand, his grip was careful, deliberate, the hand of a man who understood that permission was not the same as welcome and was not going to confuse the two. She held his hand back, just as deliberately. Outside the church, Cal Reeves pumped Owen's hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had been holding it in since the ceremony started. "Congratulations, Marshal. Ma'am." He turned to Grace with the earnest sincerity of the very young. "He's a good man, Mrs. Ellis. Real good. I've worked beside him 3 years, and I never once saw him be unfair to anybody." "That is an interesting thing to say at a wedding," Grace said. Cal blinked. I meant it as I thought. It's the best thing you could have said." Grace told him and meant it entirely. Owen was watching her when she turned back. That small, quiet attention he had, the way he noticed things and didn't perform noticing them. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, trying it out, a question in it. "That's going to take some getting used to," she said. "For both of us," he said. The house was 3 blocks from the marshal's office and 2 blocks from the boarding house, and Grace had not seen it before this moment, which struck her suddenly as a peculiar thing that she was married to a man and was now being walked to a home she had never set eyes on and would apparently be living in starting immediately. Owen unlocked the front door and stood back for her to go in first. She stepped inside. The house was clean. That was the first thing, unexpectedly, almost aggressively clean the way a place gets when someone has been preparing it with anxious care. The floors were scrubbed. There were curtains that were clearly new, still holding the fold lines from the store. On the table in the main room, there was a small bunch of dried wildflowers in a jar, the kind you could only gather in summer, which meant he'd saved them from months ago, or gotten them from someone who had. Grace stood very still. "The curtains," she said. "Did you just put those up?" "Last week," he said from behind her. "And the flowers." A pause. "Mrs. Pruitt grows things in her window boxes through the winter. I asked if she had anything." Grace turned around. Owen was standing just inside the door with his hat in his hands again, and he looked like a man trying very hard not to look like he was waiting to be judged. "Owen," she said. "They're just curtains," he said quickly. "You can change them if—" "Owen." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, and something in him settled. "I'll show you the house," he said. "And then I have to go back to the office for a few hours. There's a situation with the Halverson Ranch that won't wait past today." He said it like a man apologizing for the reality of his life on the first day of a marriage. "I know the timing is—" "Go," she said. "I'll be fine. I'll be back before supper." "I'll make supper," Grace said, and then caught herself. "I should tell you I can cook. Not extraordinarily, but I can cook." The corner of his mouth. "Better than Clara," he said, and it came out before he caught it, and for one instant, his face showed the exact cost of that, the involuntary flinch of a man who had not meant to say his dead wife's name on his wedding day in front of his new wife. Grace let the moment breathe. "I'll set the bar there then," she said. "Not extraordinarily." The flinch eased. "That's fair," he said quietly. He showed her the house. He showed her where things were kept, what the stove required, which window stuck in cold weather. He showed her the small room he used as an office, stacked with papers and ledgers in a state of organized chaos that made her itch to sort them. He showed her the bedroom, their bedroom, though he said it without emphasis, and she noticed that the side of the bed, closer to the window, had clearly been his, the slight wear in the floorboard from years of the same boots, and that he had moved his things to the other side. She had not asked him to. He had simply done it. He left for the office at noon. Grace stood in the kitchen alone and listened to the silence of a house that was now by law and ceremony her home, and she waited to feel the weight of it. What she felt instead was something unexpected, something almost like possibility. She started on supper. She had been in the house perhaps 2 hours when someone knocked on the door. The woman on the other side of it was perhaps 45, sharp-faced and elaborately dressed by frontier standards, with the smile of someone who had decided what they thought of you before they knocked and were knocking anyway, out of social obligation. "Mrs. Ellis," the woman said with an emphasis that suggested she found the name mildly surprising. "I'm Vera Colton. My husband Douglas owns the bank. I wanted to welcome you to Hecla." She held out a tin of what turned out to be cookies, the gesture of a woman delivering a test disguised as a gift. "Thank you," Grace said. "Please come in." Vera Colton came in and sat down and took in the room with the skilled peripheral vision of a woman who could inventory an entire house while appearing to look at nothing, and Grace made tea and sat across from her and waited. "I'll be honest with you," Vera said. "People in this town have opinions about the mail order arrangement. Not everyone—" She paused. Most people have opinions about it." "And your opinion?" Grace asked. "I think Owen Ellis has been grieving himself to gray for 4 years, and something needed to change." Vera looked at her directly. "Whether you're that change remains to be seen." "That seems like a fair assessment," Grace said. Vera blinked. She had clearly expected defense or apology, and she recalibrated smoothly, but Grace caught the slight adjustment. "You're not what I expected," Vera said. "Owen said that to me the day I arrived," Grace said. "I'm beginning to think it might be a good sign." Something shifted in Vera Colton's careful face. Fractionally. "He's a good man," she said, and this time it sounded like fact rather than performance. "He held this town together after the Creighton fire 2 years ago. 3 families lost everything. Owen organized the rebuilding himself. Didn't sleep for 4 days. She sipped her tea. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't talk about most of the things he does. That can be hard. For a person living beside him. Grace understood that this was information being offered as a gift, not a warning. I appreciate you telling me, she said. I'm telling you because nobody else will, Vera said. They'll bring you pies and take your measure and talk about you at the dry goods store. I'd rather you know who your husband actually is. And who is he? Grace asked. Vera looked at her over the rim of her teacup. A man who put dried flowers in a jar on his kitchen table for a woman he'd never met, she said. Make of that what you will. Owen came home at 6, as he'd said. He came through the door and stopped. The smell hit him first, something slow-cooked and real, something that had been building in the house for hours, filling up the corners and the walls the way warmth does. He stood in the doorway with his coat half off and his expression doing something complicated. You cooked, he said. I said I would. You didn't have to. I know I didn't have to, Grace said from the kitchen doorway. I wanted to. There's a difference, Owen. He hung his coat. He washed up. He sat at the table like a man relearning a motion he'd forgotten, and when Grace set a plate in front of him, he looked at it for a moment before he picked up his fork. Vera Colton came by, Grace said, sitting across from him. Owen's fork paused. Vera came by. She brought cookies and opinions. That tracks, he said. Which opinions? That people in this town will judge the arrangement. That you're a man who doesn't talk about the good things he does. That I should know who I married. Grace looked at him. She also confirmed the flowers. Owen set down his fork. I'm going to have a word with Vera Colton. Please don't, Grace said. It was kind. She was being kind in her particular way, which is direct and slightly terrifying, but kind. He looked at her. She didn't scare you off. I told you, I don't scare easily. She paused. What happened with the Halverson Ranch? He picked his fork back up. Boundary dispute. 2 brothers who inherited the same parcel from different versions of their father's will. Nothing that hasn't happened 40 times before in this county, but it has to be managed before someone decides to manage it with a rifle. Did you manage it? For today, he said. It'll need to be resolved properly, through the county judge. He ate for a moment, then said without looking up, This is good. You don't have to say that. I'm aware. It's good. A brief silence. Comfortable, almost the silence of 2 people who had run out of the need to fill every gap. Vera said you organized the rebuilding after the Creighton fire, Grace said. He kept eating. Vera talks too much. Owen. He looked up. You did a good thing, she said. You're allowed to have done it. Something passed through his face, the old habitual flinch of a man who deflected praise as a reflex. But underneath it, something else. Something that looked briefly like the face of a person who had been alone with his own goodness for so long that having it witnessed felt foreign. People needed help, he said. People always need help. Not everyone provides it. Grace held his gaze. I want to know who I married too. Not just the facts of it. Who you actually are. Owen was quiet for a long moment. I'm figuring that out, he said finally. I think I started forgetting somewhere in the last 4 years. Who I was before I was just the man who keeps the peace and goes home to an empty house. He looked at her steadily. You're the first person in a long time who's asked me that question directly. Then I'll keep asking it, Grace said, until you have an answer. He looked at her across the table, and the kitchen was warm and outside the Montana cold pressed against the walls, and found no way in. It was later that night when the real fracture showed. Grace was at the small desk in the front room, writing a letter to her father. Brief, careful, the kind of letter that reported facts without asking for feelings, when Owen came and stood in the doorway of the room with an expression she hadn't seen on him yet. Uncertain. Not the managed uncertainty of a man being careful. The raw kind. There's something I should have told you, he said. Grace set down her pen. All right. He came in and sat across from her, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at his own hands. The Halverson dispute, he said. The boundary line they're arguing over it runs adjacent to a parcel I own. 20 acres I've been holding for 2 years. He paused. Depending on how the judge rules, there's a chance the ruling impacts my deed. Grace waited. I should have disclosed that I have a financial interest in the region before I took the case, he said. I didn't. Not to the county office. Not to either of the Halverson brothers. He looked up. If that comes out, and it may, it becomes a conflict of interest question. Which becomes a conduct question. Which becomes a question about whether I'm fit to hold the office I hold. The room went still. Could you lose your position? Grace asked. If it's handled badly. He held her gaze. I wanted you to know. I didn't want you to find out from someone else, and I didn't want there to be a thing I was hiding from you on the first day of our marriage. Grace looked at him for a long moment. What are you going to do? She said. Disclose it. Tomorrow. File the statement with the county voluntarily before anyone else raises it. He said it like a man who had already made the decision and was only now telling someone else. It'll mean stepping back from the case. It'll mean some people asking questions about my judgment. But you'll still have the position, if I handle it right. His jaw tightened slightly. If I handle it wrong, or if there's someone who wants to use it as leverage. He stopped. The county commissioner has never had much use for me. We've disagreed about some things publicly. This gives him an opening. Grace was quiet. Grace, he said. If things get difficult, I want you to know that I won't. Stop, she said. He stopped. Don't tell me you won't hold me to staying, she said. You've told me that. I heard you. I don't need you to offer me the exit every time something hard comes up. She leaned forward. I need you to tell me what you need right now, not what you'll allow me to leave, what you need. Owen stared at her. I need someone to know, he said, quietly, raw. I've been carrying it since this afternoon, and I needed someone to just know. Then I know, Grace said. She reached across the space between them and put her hand over his, and she felt him go very still under it. The stillness of a man who had been touched by exactly this kind of ordinary, uncomplicated human comfort, so rarely in the past 4 years that it required a moment to process. She didn't pull away. He didn't move. The fire worked quietly in the other room, and outside the night was deep and cold and enormous, and inside this small house on the edge of the Montana frontier, something was building that had no name yet, but was undeniably real. Tomorrow, Grace said, you file the disclosure. I'll come with you if that helps. Or I'll stay here and have supper ready when you get back, whichever you need. Owen looked at the hand covering his. He turned his hand over slowly and closed his fingers around hers. Supper, he said. Please. Then supper it is, she said. She did not take her hand back for a long time, and in the quiet of that first night in their shared home, Grace Anderson. Grace Ellis, now still learning the shape of that name, understood for the first time that she had not fallen forward through the only open door. She had, without quite intending, to walk through the right one. The question now was how deep she was willing to go. Owen filed the disclosure the next morning, and the county commissioner's office received it the way a cat receives an unwanted bath, with cold-contained fury, and absolutely nowhere to put it. Grace knew it had gone badly before Owen walked back through the door. She knew from the set of his shoulders and the particular way he hung his coat. Careful, deliberate, the movements of a man managing himself precisely because if he stopped managing, he didn't know what would come out. How bad? She said from the kitchen doorway. Commissioner Hale is calling for a formal review. Owen sat down at the table. He pressed both hands flat against the wood. He's saying the conflict should have been disclosed at the moment I accepted the case, not 2 days later. He's calling the delay a pattern of poor judgment. 2 days, Grace said. You were managing a storm and a wedding, and a new you were managing a great deal. That's not how Hale sees it. What does Hale see? Owen looked up. An opportunity, he said flatly. Grace pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Tell me about Hale. Douglas Colton warned me 2 years ago that Hale wanted the marshal position for his own man, someone more cooperative. With the bank's interests with the land deals, Hale's been quietly involved in. Owen's jaw tightened. I've been in his way 3 times in the past year. A rustling case that pointed toward a man Hale had business with. A deed dispute I ruled against his preferred outcome. And the Halverson situation now. So this isn't about the disclosure, Grace said. This is about removing you. That's what I believe, yes. What does the review involve? A hearing, 3 county officials. Hale has 2 of them in his pocket. He stopped, let out a slow breath. Cal's already been asking around. Hale's been collecting statements, people who've had disputes with my rulings, building a case that I'm... He shook his head. That I'm not fit. Grace was quiet for a moment. Are you? She said. He looked at her sharply. I'm not asking to wound you, she said. I'm asking because it matters. Is there anything in your record that's genuinely indefensible? Anything that isn't about Hale's interests? Anything that's actually yours? Owen held her gaze. No, he said. Not that I know of. Then we fight it, Grace said. The word we landed in the room, and neither of them acknowledged it directly, but Owen heard it. She could see that he heard it in the slight change in his eyes, the fractional loosening of something that had been locked down since he walked back through the door. Grace, you told me last night that you needed someone to know, she said. I know, and I'm not a woman who knows something and then sits on her hands while someone uses it against a good man. She met his eyes. What do we need? What they needed, it turned out, was documentation. 3 years of it. As it happened, Owen's case records, ruling logs, complaint files, and the counter-documentation of every dispute Hale had tried to influence. Cal Reeves arrived at the house by mid-afternoon with a box of papers under each arm and the expression of a young man who had chosen his side and was committed to the consequences. Everything from the office archive, Cal said, setting the boxes on the table, plus my own notes from the Creighton situation. And... He hesitated. And I talked to Reverend Holt. He says he'll speak at the hearing if it comes to that. Holt doesn't have to do that, Owen said. He said to tell you that and said to tell you he's doing it anyway, Cal said. He glanced at Grace with the slightly awestruck look he'd been directing at her since the wedding. Mrs. Ellis, I have to say, I've never seen Owen ask for help before, not once in 3 years. He didn't ask, Grace said, pulling the first box toward her. I volunteered. There's a difference. Owen looked at her across the table. She was already opening files. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, and Grace discovered 3 things in that time that she hadn't known before. The first was that Owen Ellis's record was, as he'd said, genuinely clean. Not perfect. There were 2 rulings. She could see arguments against cases where a different marshal might have gone differently, but nothing corrupt. Nothing that couldn't be explained and defended by a man who had consistently chosen the town's interest over his own ease. The second thing she discovered was in a folder near the bottom of the second box, misfiled under a routine livestock dispute from 18 months ago. It was a letter handwritten from Commissioner Hale to a man named Garrett Briggs, who was, according to the letterhead of the response stapled behind it, the owner of the largest cattle operation in the next county. The letter discussed in careful but unmistakable language the anticipated availability of certain parcels of land adjacent to the Halverson property. Land that would only become available if the Halverson dispute resolved in a specific direction, a direction that would require a compliant local marshal. Grace read it twice. Then she said very quietly, Owen. He looked up from what he was reading. She slid the letter across the table without a word. He read it. She watched his face go through 3 distinct things: recognition, anger, and then a cold, deliberate calm that was more unsettling than the anger. Where was this? He said. Misfiled. Bottom of the second box. Cal, Owen said. Cal, who had been reading in the corner, came to the table. He read the letter. He looked up. He was 22 years old, but in that moment, he didn't look it. That's evidence of a scheme, he said. That's not just conflict of interest. That's whoosh fraud, Owen said. Potentially, depending on what the land deal actually was. He set the letter down. His hands were very still. If I bring this to the hearing, Hale will say I fabricated it. It's in his handwriting, Grace said. He'll say I forged it. Then we get a handwriting comparison. We find another sample of his writing on official documents and put them side by side in front of the three-person panel. Owen looked at her. I'm a teacher, she said. I spent 6 years assessing students who tried to lie their way through examinations. I know how to build an evidentiary argument. She paused. And if 2 of the 3 panelists are Hale's men, who is the third? Owen and Cal exchanged a look. Judge Amos Birch, Cal said. County Circuit Judge. He rotates through. Is he Hale's man? No, Owen said slowly. Birch is nobody's man. He's honest, and he's thorough, and he does not like being made a fool of. Then we present the letter to Birch, Grace said. Directly, before the hearing. We request a private conference with the judge on the grounds of newly discovered material evidence bearing on the integrity of the review process itself. Both men stared at her. Can we do that? Cal said. I have no idea, Grace said. Owen. Owen picked up the letter again. He read it one more time slowly. It's irregular, he said. Hale calling for a review 2 days after you filed a voluntary disclosure is irregular, Grace said. Irregular seems to be what's happening. A silence. Then Owen looked up, and for the first time since he'd walked back through the door that morning, something in his face was not just managed calm. It was actual steadiness, the kind that comes from having a plan, from having someone beside you who is thinking as fast as you are and pulling in the same direction. All right, he said. We request the conference. Judge Birch arrived in Hecla on Wednesday for what he had been told was a preliminary review matter. He was a large, slow-moving man with small, extraordinarily quick eyes, and he listened to Owen for 11 minutes without interrupting, which Grace took as a good sign. When Owen finished, Birch looked at the letter for a long time. Then he looked at Grace. You found this? He said. Yes, sir. In the marshal's own files. Misfiled in a routine box, yes. Possibly placed there by someone who assumed it would never be reviewed carefully. Birch looked at the letter again. Mrs. Ellis, he said. What did you teach before you came to Montana? Literature and composition, Your Honor. And you recognized this as significant. I recognized it as a man writing down things he should not have written down, Grace said. People who are certain they won't be caught often do that. Birch set the letter on his desk. He pressed one finger flat against it. He did not speak for a full 30 seconds, and the office was so quiet that Grace could hear her own heartbeat. Marshal Ellis, Birch said finally. I'm suspending the review pending a full investigation into the contents of this letter and Mr. Hale's conduct regarding the Halverson land parcel. Owen held very still. Yes, sir. The disclosure question is resolved. Voluntary disclosure filed promptly, no pattern established. Birch looked at him over the edge of his glasses. You should have come to me directly 2 years ago when Hale started interfering with your cases. I didn't have documentation 2 years ago, Owen said. You have it now. Birch picked up the letter. I'll take this from here. You go home, Marshal. Odd. They walked back to the house in the cold, and they didn't speak for the first block. Cal had gone back to the office, and it was just the two of them, Grace's arm through Owen's, because she'd taken it without thinking when they came down the courthouse steps, and neither of them had adjusted. That could have gone differently, Owen said. But it didn't, Grace said. Grace. He stopped walking. She stopped with him. What you did in there, the way you argued that case, that wasn't just finding a letter. That was... He shook his head slightly. I've never had anyone go to the mat for me like that, not since Clara. The name again. But this time it didn't land between them like an apology. It landed like what it was, a truth of comparison, an acknowledgement that Grace had just done something that placed her in the category of people who mattered. Grace looked at him in the cold street. "You'd have done the same for me," she said. "I know that. I've known it since you picked up every single thing that fell out of my bag on the day I arrived." Owen looked at her for a long moment. His breath was visible in the cold air. His eyes were doing the thing they did, that direct, quiet seeing that she'd stopped trying to deflect and had simply started letting happen. "I'm going to say something," he said. "Say it," she said. "I think I made the best decision of my life when I wrote that letter to the agency." He said it simply, no drama in it, just a man saying a true thing. Grace felt it go straight through her, the way true things do when you aren't braced for them. "You don't know that yet," she said. "We've been married 6 days." "I know enough," he said. She looked at him. She thought about Boston, about the girls' school, about the apartment that slowly emptied of furniture as her father sold things to cover debts, about the cold calculation she'd made, sitting at a borrowed desk, reading an agency advertisement, and thinking, this is what's left. She thought about the woman who had climbed onto a stagecoach, expecting nothing but survival. "Ask me in a year," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Ask me in a year and I'll tell you the same thing back." Owen reached out and tucked a loose piece of her hair back from her face. The gesture was so quiet, so careful, so ordinary tender that Grace had to look away for a second. "A year," he said. He started walking again. She walked with him. "I can work with a year." It was the following week when Vera Colton appeared at the house with a face that meant news before she opened her mouth, and the news was not good. "Hale is saying you planted the letter," she told Owen, who received this with no visible surprise. "He's telling anyone who'll listen that your new wife fabricated the whole thing to protect you." "Of course he is," Owen said. "He's calling her an opportunist," Vera said. "He's saying the whole mail order situation was suspicious from the beginning. That a woman who arrives from Boston with nothing is the kind of woman who'll do anything to secure her position." The kitchen went sharp and quiet. Grace had been at the counter. She turned around. "And what are the people listening saying?" she asked. Vera looked at her. "Some are believing him," she said. "I won't lie to you. Some people in this town want an easier Marshal, and Hale is giving them a story to hang that want on." She paused. "But Birch hasn't wavered, and 3 of the families Owen helped after the Creighton fire have made their opinions known publicly." "That's something," Owen said. "It's more than something," Vera said. "It just may not be enough if Hale gets to the right people before the investigation finishes." She looked at Grace. "How are you?" "I'm angry," Grace said. Simply, clearly. Vera blinked. "I came 2,000 miles, Grace said. "In the middle of a Montana winter, married a man I didn't know, spent the first days of my marriage buried in case files, walked into a judge's office and argued evidentiary procedure from memory, and now a man who was committing actual fraud is calling me an opportunist." She paused. "I'm not frightened, and I'm not ashamed, and I'm not going anywhere. I'm angry." Vera looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Owen. "I see why you wrote to the agency," she said. "She's something," Owen agreed. "Stop talking about me like I'm a horse you're proud of," Grace said. Both Owen and Vera made the same split-second face, startled and amused, and slightly chastened, and then Vera Colton laughed. It was a real laugh, not the practiced social variety, and it changed her whole face. "All right," Vera said. "Here's what I can do. Douglas controls the town ledger for the improvement committee. If Hale's land scheme involves any of the county improvement funds, and I'd bet my best china it does, Douglas can pull those records in 48 hours. She looked at Owen. "You want them?" "Yes," Owen said. "Done." She stood up. "Grace?" She paused. "I owe you an apology for how I spoke the first day. I came here to take your measure. That was unkind. You were protecting someone you respected," Grace said. "I understand that." I was patronizing someone I didn't know, Vera said. There's a difference. She put on her coat. You'll both come to dinner on Friday. I won't take no. She left. Grace looked at the closed door. You have good people in this town, she said. Getting better, Owen said, and looked at her. Mike. The investigation took 11 days, and for 11 days, Hecla buzzed with the particular electric tension of a small community that has discovered it is more complicated than it thought. Hale made noise. Douglas Colton delivered records. Cal Reeves turned out to have a memory like a steel trap for things Hale had said in public that contradicted his current version of events, and he wrote every one of them down in a deposition that Birch read twice. On the 11th day, Owen came home at 4 in the afternoon, early unexpectedly, and Grace heard the door and came out of the front room where she had been reading, and she looked at his face, and she knew. It's over, she said. It's over, he said. Hale resigned the commissioner position this morning. Birch forwarded the letter and the financial records to the territorial prosecutor's office. He leaned against the doorframe. He looked like a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just set it down. It's over. Grace crossed the room. She put both arms around him without ceremony, without deliberation, simply because he was standing there, having survived something, and the human thing, the right thing, was to hold on to him. He went very still for a fraction of a second. Then his arms came around her, and he held on with the careful strength of a man who hadn't held anyone in 4 years, and wasn't sure he remembered how. He remembered. Thank you, he said into her hair. Grace. Thank you. She didn't tell him not to thank her. She didn't deflect, didn't pull the exit clause back out, didn't remind him they'd only been married 2 weeks. She stood in the doorway of the house on the edge of the Montana frontier and held on and let herself be held. Outside, the cold was absolute. Inside, it didn't reach them. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, terrified and frozen and braced for the worst, Grace Ellis was not waiting for something to go wrong. She was simply here. And here, against every calculation she had made, sitting at a borrowed desk in Boston, was enough. The week after the investigation closed was the quietest Owen Ellis had known in 2 years, and he didn't trust it. He told Grace this at breakfast on a Thursday morning, 11 days after Hale's resignation, 3 weeks into their marriage, and she looked at him over her coffee cup with the particular expression she'd developed for moments when he said something that revealed more than he intended. You don't know how to do this, she said. Do what? Not be at war with something. He opened his mouth, closed it. That's accurate, she said pleasantly. You've been managing a threat for 2 years. The threat is gone, and now you wake up every morning waiting for the next one because the quiet feels wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm starting to find it unsettling, he said. How well you read people. 6 years in a girls' school, she said. I spent 6 years reading 17-year-olds trying to hide things. You're considerably less subtle than a 17-year-old. That's not as comforting as you think it is. It isn't meant to be comforting. It's meant to be accurate. She set her cup down. Owen, it's all right to breathe. The town is still here. Your badge is still on. Birch handled Hale. Breathe. He looked at his hands on the table. He thought about the 4 years of waking up in a house that had no one in it. He thought about the particular way tension becomes its own kind of company when you've lived with it long enough, how its absence leaves a space that isn't quite comfortable yet. I'm working on it, he said. Good, she said, and went back to her coffee. He watched her. She was reading a letter from her father, the second one since their marriage, which meant her father was making an effort, and she was frowning slightly at it, the way she frowned at things that required careful handling. She had a small ink stain on the side of her right hand from the letter she'd written back yesterday, and she hadn't noticed it was still there. He thought I made the best decision of my life, and then immediately felt the familiar flinch. The old reflex of a man who had decided not to want things too hard, because wanting things hard was how you ended up standing at a grave at 30 years old, trying to remember how to be a person. He pushed the flinch back. He breathed. The Halverson brothers want to meet, he said. "They've agreed to accept the county surveyor's ruling on the boundary. They want to shake hands in front of a witness and be done with it." "Good," Grace said without looking up from her letter. "They asked if you'd be the witness." She looked up. "They said—" He paused. "Isaac Halverson said that you were the one who kept the situation from going sideways. He heard about what happened with Birch. He wants to thank you directly." Grace set the letter down. She was quiet for a moment, and something moved through her face that she didn't quite cover surprise, and beneath it, something softer. The expression of a woman who was still getting used to being seen as someone who mattered. "Tell them yes," she said. Aboig. The handshake happened at the marshal's office on Friday afternoon, and it was brief and slightly awkward and entirely genuine, the way real resolution usually was. Nothing like the dramatic scenes in novels, just two tired men who had been angry for too long, finally deciding that the fence line wasn't worth whatever came next. Isaac Halverson was the older of the brothers, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, and he took Grace's hand afterward, with the careful grip of a man making a point. "My wife wants to have you both to dinner," he said. "When you're ready. She makes the best elk stew in the county, and she takes it personally if people don't come eat it." "We'd be honored," Grace said. Walking back to the house, Owen bumped his shoulder against hers in the easy, unplanned way of people who had gotten comfortable with each other's proximity. "Elk stew," he said. "Is it good?" "It's outstanding," he said. "Martha Halverson is the cook Hale's wife wishes she was." Grace laughed. It came out free and clear, not the careful, measured version she'd deployed in the first days, but the real one. Owen heard it and felt something shift in him that he'd stopped pretending not to notice. He was falling in love with his wife. He'd known it was happening for a week. He'd been watching it happen with the same measured, slightly alarmed attention he gave to anything that mattered this much. The way you watch a bridge you're crossing and try not to look at the water. He hadn't said it yet. He wasn't going to say it yet. She'd asked him to give her a year, and he intended to give her a year, and he understood why she needed it, and he was not going to say, "I love you" to a woman who had come 2,000 miles on the strength of 6 letters and needed time to trust that she hadn't miscalculated. He was just going to keep walking beside her on the frozen streets of Hecla and bumping her shoulder and listening to that laugh and waiting. The letter from Boston arrived on a Monday. Grace was alone in the house when it came. Owen was at the office. Cal had ridden out to the Halverson property for a follow-up, and she stood in the doorway, holding it for a long moment before she opened it. The return address was not her father's. It was a man named Robert Ashby. She sat down before she opened it. Robert Ashby was the son of her father's former business partner. 29 years old, handsome in the correct approved manner of handsome Boston men, and he had asked Grace to marry him 14 months ago. She had said no. Not because she didn't like him, she did after a fashion, but because she had seen clearly, and without self-delusion, that what Robert Ashby wanted was a decorative wife who would not outthink him in company, and that she would slowly disappear inside that marriage the way certain women did. Pleasantly. With good furniture. She'd said no, and he'd been gracious about it, which had almost made her wonder if she'd miscalculated, and then he'd married a woman named Florence Whitmore 3 months later, which confirmed that she hadn't. She opened the letter. It was 3 pages. She read all 3 with the particular stillness of a person absorbing information that requires careful processing before reacting. By the end of the 3rd page, her hand was not quite steady. She folded the letter. She put it on the table. She stood up and went to the window and stood there breathing. Florence Ashby had died in October, an illness swift and brutal. Robert had a 4-year-old daughter named Eliza. He had heard through what remained of the Boston social network that Grace had gone west for a marriage arrangement, and he was writing to say carefully correctly, in the measured language of a man who had never once in his life said a direct thing when an indirect one was available, that if her circumstances were not as she had hoped, he would very much like to discuss alternatives. He was offering her a way back. A real way back. Robert Ashby was not her father's bad choices. He was established, stable kind, in his particular careful fashion, and he was offering her Boston and her father's circle, and a world she understood. She stood at the window for a long time. She heard the front door at 5:30. "Grace?" Owen called from the hallway. Then, hearing nothing back, "Grace." He came to the doorway of the front room. He saw her at the window. He saw the letter on the table. "What happened?" he said. She turned around. She looked at him, this man she'd known for 24 days. This steady, careful man with kind eyes who had picked up her scattered things and made her supper and gone to the mat without being asked, and she felt the shape of the choice in her chest like a stone. "Someone wrote to me from Boston," she said. Owen came into the room. He didn't pick up the letter. He sat down in the chair across from where she'd been sitting and looked at her and waited. She told him. All of it. Robert Ashby and the original proposal and the marriage to Florence and the death and the 3-page letter with its careful indirect offer. She told it plainly, without minimizing and without editorializing. The way he'd taught her by example was how you told a person something true. When she finished, Owen was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I don't know," she said. And then, because he deserved more than that, "I'm not going. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going back to Boston." Something in his face moved. "Grace." "I'm not going," she said again, firmer. "That's not the problem. The problem is—" She stopped, pressed her hand against the center of her chest. "The problem is that the letter made me realize something. About myself, about why I came here." Owen looked at her steadily. "Tell me." "I told you I came because I ran out of options," she said. "And that was true, but I think I also came because I was afraid. Not of poverty or failure. Afraid of what happened to my mother, loving someone so completely that when they're gone, there's nothing left of yourself." She looked at him. "I said I wanted to be useful. What I actually wanted was to matter without having to risk anything." The room was very still. "And," Owen said, quietly, "and I've been here 24 days, she said, "and I have already risked things I didn't plan to risk. And I am already—" She stopped. Her voice was not fully under her control, and she acknowledged that without trying to fix it. "I am already somewhere I did not expect to be this quickly." And Robert Ashby's letter landed on that like a match. Owen stood up. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and he didn't touch her, just stood close enough that she could see every line of his face. "Tell me what you're actually saying," he said, directly. "No exits, no qualifications. Tell me what you mean." She looked up at him. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she said. "And it terrifies me. And I needed you to know that because you've been honest with me from the first day, and I owe you the same." The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. Then Owen put both hands on either side of her face carefully, like she was something he was afraid of breaking, and he looked at her with the eyes she'd been refusing to fully look into for 3 weeks, because she'd known if she did, she'd see something she wasn't ready for. She was ready now. "Grace," he said, "I have been in love with you since you sat across from me at that card table and held 3 queens without blinking." The breath went out of her. "That was day 2, she said. "Day 2, he said. "I know. I'm aware of how that sounds." "It sounds—" She stopped. She felt the laugh come up through the fear the way it sometimes did, genuine, surprised, involuntary. "It sounds exactly like something you'd say." He was smiling. That real smile, not the small, careful one she'd been trying to collect, the full one. The one that changed his whole face and made him look like the man he'd been before 4 years of a quiet house had narrowed him down. "Right back to Ashby," Owen said. "Tell him you appreciate his consideration and that you're staying in Montana." "I know. And tell him your husband says good luck." She laughed again, and he pulled her in, and she let him. 2 days later, something happened that none of them had accounted for. A man rode into Hecla on a gray horse with a territorial land agent's badge on his coat, and he went directly to the marshal's office, and his name was Pierce Dunford, and he was carrying a document that changed the shape of everything. Owen came home at noon midday, which he never did, and Grace saw his face and went cold. "What is it?" He set the document on the table. "The 20 acres I own," he said, "adjacent to the Halverson parcel." "What about it?" "The original deed," he said, "has a prior claim on it, from 1871, a homestead filing that was never properly resolved when the original claimant abandoned the land." He sat down. "Dunford is a territorial land agent. He's saying the deed I hold may be invalid." Grace sat down across from him. "How is that possible? You've held that land for 6 years, Owen said. "I bought it clean, or I thought I did. But Dunford says the original filing from 71 creates a cloud on the title. It has to be resolved before any of the Halverson adjacent parcels can be properly recorded. And if it can't be resolved, I lose the land." He looked at the document. 20 acres is not a fortune, but I paid for it and I was intending—" He stopped. "Intending what?" Grace said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to build on it," he said. "Eventually. Something larger than this house. Something with room for—" He stopped again. His jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter right now." "Owen." She reached across the table. "What were you going to build?" He looked at her. "A proper house," he said. "For a family. I bought the land 2 years before I wrote to the agency. I bought it because Clara made me promise not to stop living and buying land, felt like a way of keeping that promise without having to feel it too directly." The table went quiet. "You've been planning for this," Grace said, not accusing, understanding. "For the idea of it," he said. "Not for you specifically. I didn't know you existed, but for the possibility of it. Yes." Grace looked at the document. "Then we fix it," she said. "What does Dunford need to clear the prior claim? Evidence that the original homesteader formally abandoned the claim. A signed statement, a death record, or a court dissolution from the period." 1871, Grace said. 14 years ago. Territorial records. "Which are in Helena," Owen said. "Which means a request to the Territorial Archive, which takes, how long? Weeks, sometimes months. Then we file immediately, and we wait," Grace said. "And while we wait, is Dunford acting alone? Or is this connected to Hale?" Owen's eyes sharpened. "What makes you ask that?" "Because the timing is exact," Grace said. "Hale is gone. His scheme is being investigated. His interest in that land parcel is suddenly public record. And now a territorial agent appears with a cloud on your adjacent title." She looked at him directly. "Who benefits from your deed being invalid right now?" Owen stared at her. "If my deed is voided," he said slowly, "the parcel reverts to territorial jurisdiction. And territorial land under review can be claimed by a new filing, by anyone with the right connections to the territorial office." "Was Hale's man in the territorial office?" Grace said. Owen stood up. "Cal," he said, already reaching for his coat. "Some Cal Reeves had, in the 3 weeks since the investigation, quietly become one of the more useful people Grace had encountered in her life. He had a young man's energy, a hound dog's instincts for following a trail, and the particular advantage of being underestimated by everyone who didn't know him, which was most of the people in 2 counties. He came to the house within 20 minutes of Owen sending for him and listened to the theory with his head tilted slightly, the way he did when he was filing information into a system only he could access. "Dunford," he said. "Pierce Dunford." "You know the name," Owen said. "I've heard it." Cal's eyes went distant for a moment. 2 years ago, before the Creighton fire. There was talk about a land consolidation scheme, somebody buying up small parcels around mining claims before they played out and reselling to a railroad interest. The name Dunford came up in connection with a title agent in Helena. He paused. "A title agent named Morrison, who was connected to Hale's business partner in the next county." The room went tight and quiet. "He's not a territorial agent," Grace said. "Or not only one." "He may have the badge legally," Cal said. "But who sent him here, and who he's reporting back to, that's a different question." Owen looked at Grace. Grace looked at Owen. Between them, in the space of 3 weeks, and a marriage, and a letter from Boston, and a letter from a dead woman named Clara, who had made her husband promise to keep living, something had built that required no words to communicate across a room. "Cal," Owen said, "I need you to ride to Helena." Cal was already standing up. "How fast?" "Yesterday," Owen said. "I'll leave in an hour." Cal looked at Grace. "Mrs. Ellis, you have a gift for this." "For what?" she said. "For seeing the thing underneath the thing," he said. "Owen's good at law. You're good at truth." He put on his hat. "Between the two of you, this county's in better hands than it's ever been." He went out. Grace and Owen stood in the kitchen, in the particular silence of two people who have just realized that the fight they thought was over was not over, and that they are both tired, and that they are both, despite being tired, going to keep going. "I'm sorry," Owen said. "You didn't sign up for this." "Stop," she said. "Grace, stop apologizing for your life," she said. "I'm in your life. That means I'm in all of it, not just the quiet parts." She looked at him. "I found the first letter in a file box. I'll find whatever needs finding this time, too." Owen looked at her for a long moment. "You told me you came here because you ran out of options," he said. "I did." "I don't think that's true anymore," he said. "I think Robert Ashby's letter was an option. I think you chose." She met his eyes. "I chose," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and kissed her. Not carefully, not with the measured deliberateness of a man managing himself, but directly, fully, with all of whatever he'd been keeping on the correct side of the line for 3 weeks. She kissed him back the same way with all of whatever she'd been refusing to call by its name since the first night she'd watched him walk out into a storm and stood in a warm room with her hand pressed to her own chest. When they stepped back, both of them were breathing slightly differently than before. "Well," Grace said. "Yes," Owen said. "That was long overdue," he said. "Considerably," she agreed. Outside, Hecla went about its afternoon. Inside the small house on the edge of the frontier, Grace Ellis stood in her kitchen in the life she had chosen, and felt not the braced for the worst that had carried her 2,000 miles. Not the careful numbness of a woman managing her expectations, but something wide open and real, and entirely hers. Whatever Dunford and Morrison and Helena brought next, she would face it. She had faced worse, and she would not be facing it alone. Cal Reeves rode back from Helena in 4 days, which was 2 days faster than anyone had expected, and 1 day faster than his horse appreciated. He came through the door of the marshal's office, stamping mud off his boots and carrying a leather satchel that he set on Owen's desk with the satisfaction of a man delivering exactly what he promised. "Morrison," Cal said. "Real name, Theodore Alden Morrison. Territorial Land Records Clerk, Helena office. Been in the position 11 years. And in those 11 years he has quietly misfiled, delayed, or reclassified 14 prior homestead claims on parcels adjacent to active mining surveys." He opened the satchel. "I have 8 of them documented with witnesses, including the 1871 filing on your parcel, Owen. The original claimant, a man named Ezra Potts, filed a formal abandonment with Morrison's office in 1873. Morrison buried it." Owen looked at the papers. "He buried it deliberately." "To keep the title clouded," Grace said. She was standing at Owen's shoulder, reading as fast as he was, so that when the right buyer came along, someone connected to Hale or the railroad interest, the parcel could be quietly cleared and transferred. 14 times, Owen said. 14 parcels, Cal confirmed. Your land was the last one he hadn't managed to move yet. He paused. Dunford has already left Hecla. I had a wire waiting for me in Helena from Birch. Dunford surrendered his badge this morning. Morrison was suspended pending a full territorial investigation. The office went quiet. Owen stood with his hands flat on the desk and looked at the papers that proved his land was his and his title was clean, and the scheme that had spent 2 years building against him was finally genuinely completely finished. It's over, Grace said. It's actually over. Owen said. Don't say it like that, she said. Like you're waiting for one more thing. He looked at her. Old habit. Break it, she said. Cal looked between them with the expression he'd been perfecting for the past month. The expression of a young man watching something real happen between two people and being quietly moved by it and determined not to show it. He failed as usual. So the deed is valid, he said. The land is yours. Clean title properly recorded. Clean title, Owen said. He looked at Grace. I told you I was going to build something on it. You did. I'd like to start in the spring, he said, if that suits you. She looked at him. Are you asking my opinion on a house you were planning to build before you knew I existed? I'm asking my wife's opinion on the house we're going to live in, he said. Yes. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said simply, Ask me tonight. I have something to tell you first. Owen went still. Cal suddenly discovered an urgent need to file something on the other side of the room. What do you need to tell me? Owen said. Tonight, Grace said. When we're home. She told him at the kitchen table with supper between them and the fire going in the next room, and the particular weight of something enormous sitting in her chest since the morning when the certainty had finally settled past the possibility of doubting it. I'm pregnant, she said. Owen set down his fork. He looked at her across the table and did not speak for 4 full seconds, which Grace counted, and in those 4 seconds she watched every single thing he felt move through his face without disguise. Shock first, and then something that cracked open behind it, something enormous and unguarded and old. The emotion of a man who had stood at a grave and been handed back an ordinary future and had been walking carefully around the edges of that future for 4 years, afraid to want it too directly. Grace, he said. His voice was not entirely steady. I know, she said. I know it's fast. We've been married 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, she said. I know. How long have you known? I suspected for a week. I was certain this morning. She looked at him. Are you all right? He stood up from the table. He came around to her side, and he crouched down in front of her chair and took both her hands and looked up at her and Grace Ellis, who had crossed 2,000 miles. Braced for the worst, looked down into the face of this man and saw something so undefended and full that it stopped her breath. Are you all right? He said. Yes, she said. I'm frightened. I'm also yes. I'm all right. Good. He pressed her hands against his chest. She could feel his heart beat fast and real and completely unmanaged. Good. Owen, Claire and I tried, he said. For 2 years. It didn't happen. He stopped, looked down for a moment, looked back up. I had made a kind of peace with the idea that this was not going to be part of my life. His grip on her hands tightened slightly. I want you to know that you changed what I believed was possible. Before I knew about this, just by being here. Grace's eyes were burning, and she decided not to pretend they weren't. I came here with nothing, she said. A bag full of scattered things and a letter that said I would not be a burden. You are the opposite of a burden, he said. You are grace. You are the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I know how to say. She leaned down and put her forehead against his. He held on. Outside Montana was cold and enormous and absolute. Inside this small house on its edge, there was a fire going, and 2 people holding each other in the kitchen, and a life being built in real time from the materials of plain human courage. The house, Grace said after a moment. Spring, Owen said. We'll start in spring. It needs a proper nursery, she said. It'll have one. He stood up. He pulled her to her feet. He held her face in his hands the same way he had the night she'd told him she was falling in love with him, like something precious and real, and entirely his to protect. You and I are going to be all right, he said. I need you to believe that. I believe it, she said. You're sure? Owen, she said. I'm the woman who walked into a judge's office in a Montana territory and argued evidentiary procedure from memory on 3 weeks of marriage. I am entirely sure." He laughed. That full, unguarded laugh that she'd been collecting since the first time she'd seen it at the card table, and she thought now that she would spend the rest of her life finding ways to produce it. Spring came, the way Montana. Spring always came reluctantly in fits and starts. 2 warm days followed by a bitter one, like a season that hadn't fully committed. But it came. The morning Owen and Cal and 2 men from the Halverson Ranch broke ground on the 20 acres Grace stood at the edge of the cleared land and watched, and Mrs. Pruitt stood beside her with her arms folded and the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to know when something was exactly right. "He came to me, you know," Mrs. Pruitt said, "before he wrote to the agency. He sat in my front room and he said, 'Adeline, I think I need to find a way to be a person again.' And I said, 'Owen, you've been a person the whole time. You just need someone to see it.'" Grace watched Owen drive a stake into the frozen earth with the focused energy of a man doing something with his future and knowing it. "And then you recommended the agency," Grace said. "I recommended that he stop waiting for something to be safe before he wanted it." Mrs. Pruitt looked sideways at her. "You were not what I expected either, you know. Owen said that to me when I stepped off the stagecoach." He was right. Mrs. Pruitt looked back at the clearing. "I expected someone quieter, someone who'd been worn down enough to be grateful for whatever she got." She paused. "You're not that." "No," Grace said. "I'm not." "Good," Mrs. Pruitt said. "He doesn't need gratitude. He needs a match." Jim, she told her father about the baby in April. The letter took 2 weeks to reach Boston, and another 2 to come back. And when it did, it was the longest letter her father had written her since she was a child. He wrote about her mother. He wrote about the early days of their marriage, the years before the money, before the business, before all of it, when they'd had nothing but each other and 2 rooms in a building on the east side of the city, and had been, he said, the happiest they would ever be. He wrote, "I am sorry. I let the loss of things make me forget what mattered. I am sorry it took you going 2,000 miles for me to understand that you always knew better than I did. I hope he is worthy of you. From everything you have written, I believe he is." Grace read that letter 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in the box with her mother's letters and went downstairs and told Owen what it said. Owen listened. When she finished, he said, "I'd like to meet him." Grace looked at him. "You would?" "He raised you," Owen said simply. "That accounts for a great deal." In June, the frame of the new house went up. Vera Colton organized a building party the way Vera organized everything with complete authority, and the implicit understanding that disagreeing with her on the logistics was a battle no one had ever won. Half the town showed up. Isaac and Martha Halverson brought food enough for twice that number. Reverend Holt blessed the foundation in a ceremony that lasted 4 minutes because he was a practical man who understood that people had lumber to raise. Cal Reeves climbed the frame to attach the highest beam and nearly gave Owen a heart attack in the process. "Get down," Owen said. "I'm fine," Cal called down. "That's what Grace said when she stepped off the stagecoach," Owen said. "And she was demonstrably not fine." "I'm fine differently than she was not fine," Cal said. And Grace laughed from somewhere behind Owen's left shoulder, and Owen turned around and looked at her and completely lost track of his concern about the beam. She was laughing in the June sunshine with her hair coming loose and her hand resting on the very slight curve of her abdomen that had appeared in the past 2 weeks, and which Owen found himself looking at approximately 40 times a day with the expression of a man who still could not fully believe his own good fortune. She caught him looking. "Stop it," she said. "I'm not doing anything." "You're doing the face." "What face?" "The face you do," she said, "when you're thinking something you consider too large to say out loud." He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps. He put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in front of Vera Colton and Mrs. Pruitt and both Halverson brothers and Reverend Holt, who closed his eyes briefly in what was probably not disapproval. Owen Ellis, Grace said when he stepped back. Grace Ellis, he said. People are watching. I know, he said. I don't particularly care. She looked at him. This man she had not planned on in this life, she had not imagined on this land she had come to on the strength of desperation and 6 letters. And she felt something so complete and solid that she understood finally that she had not arrived at the end of something. She had arrived at the beginning. The baby came in November. He came fast and loud and with complete disregard for Owen's composure, which did not survive the waiting and was fully dismantled by the moment Martha Halverson, who had delivered half the children in the county and was the calmest person Grace had ever encountered in a crisis, put a son into Owen Ellis's arms for the first time. Owen sat in the chair beside the bed and held the baby and did not speak for a long time. Grace watched him from where she lay exhausted and entirely awake, and she watched his face do the thing that faces did when something happened that was too large for the ordinary muscles of expression. He's real, Owen said finally. He is, Grace said. He's very small. He'll grow. Owen looked up at her. His eyes were wet, and he made no attempt to conceal it, which was one of the things she had learned about him, that he was not a man who hid his real feelings from her. He had stopped doing that sometime around week 3, and she had loved him for it every day since. What do we name him? Owen said. They had discussed it. They'd had the conversation twice, once in September and once in October, and both times had circled around the same names without landing. But now, with the baby actually real and present, and making small sounds in Owen's arms, the answer settled in Grace like it had been there all along. James, she said, for your middle name. Owen went very still. And Thomas, she said, for my father. Owen looked down at the baby. He looked up at Grace, and what crossed his face in that moment, the full unguarded weight of it, was not something that required words, and she did not reach for any. She simply held his gaze and let him feel everything he was feeling and did not look away. James Thomas Ellis, Owen said. Welcome to Montana, Grace said quietly to the baby. It's cold, and it's enormous, and the people here will take your measure and then fight for you when it counts. She paused. You'll be all right here. James Thomas Ellis made a small decisive sound that suggested he had views on the subject and would be sharing them at volume. 2 weeks later, when the house had settled into the particular rhythm of new parenthood, beautiful and exhausting, and unlike anything either of them had prepared for, Owen came home from the office at noon again, the second time he'd done that. Grace looked up from the chair where she was feeding James and waited. He stood in the doorway with an envelope in his hand. From the territorial office, he said. The final deed registration. Clean title properly recorded, Morrison's misfiling officially struck from the record. He looked at her. The land is ours. The house is ours. Everything we built here, it's ours, legally and permanently. Grace looked at him. She looked at the baby in her arms. She looked at the man in the doorway, who had picked up every scattered thing she'd dropped on a frozen morning 6 months ago, and handed it all back to her without comment. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in a Montana blizzard, braced for the worst, carrying nothing but the promise of her own smallness. She thought about what that woman had become. Come sit down, she said. You're letting the cold in. Owen Ellis stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. He sat down beside his wife and his son in the house he had built on land that was finally fully, uncontestably his, and the cold stayed outside where it belonged. Grace had come 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, and she had found something that no agency letter, no arranged agreement, no careful practical calculation could have predicted or planned or promised. She had found a man who saw her completely honestly without flinching and chose her anyway, and she had chosen him back. Not because she had no other choice, because she had looked at every choice available to her, and she had chosen this one, and she would choose it again every single morning for the rest of her life, without hesitation and without regret. That was not the ending of something. That was the only beginning that had ever mattered.